What happens when a powerful CEO walks into his own company, and no one knows who he is? When Malcolm Hayes posed as a regular customer, he didn't expect to uncover a secret that would shake his entire empire. But what he found behind polished smiles and luxury homes was a truth no press release could fix. Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like, share this video, and subscribe to the channel to help us reach 1,000 subscribers. Your support means the world to us and inspires us to create even more engaging content. Thank you. On a mild Thursday morning, just past 9 a.m., the executive floor at Bright Living Properties buzzed with its usual quiet precision. The glass walls, pristine furniture, and unobtrusive lighting gave the place a kind of polished calm. But for Malcolm Hayes, the man behind the glass desk in the far corner office, that morning felt off. Malcolm had spent the past 20 years building Bright Living into one of the most reputable real estate firms in the Southeast. Their developments were featured in lifestyle magazines. Their neighborhoods advertised as inclusive sanctuaries for modern living. But the anonymous report blinking on his internal dashboard told a different story. The message was brief but clear. Several agents at the Southgate office are steering black clients away from high-value listings. At least 3 cases in the last 2 months. No one's saying anything, but it's real. I had to speak up. No name, just a timestamp. It wasn't the first anonymous tip to cross his desk. But something in the wording stuck. It wasn't angry or dramatic. Just tired. Honest. Instead of forwarding the report to compliance like he usually would, Malcolm leaned back, tapped his pen against the armrest, and stared out the window. Southgate was one of their newer offices, stylish, high traffic, and led by a management team he'd personally approved. But if something was off there, he needed to know firsthand. The next morning, Malcolm walked into the Southgate branch dressed in khakis, a charcoal gray blazer, and sneakers. Not his usual tailored suit. He didn't give his real name. Didn't call ahead. Instead, he signed in as Mark Ellis, a retired postal worker looking to buy a small home for his mother who'd just moved in with him. Tiffany Green was the first to greet him. She smiled politely, walked him to a consultation table, and offered him bottled water. Her tone was professional, her gestures rehearsed. Malcolm watched her carefully, noticing how her smile stiffened ever so slightly when she asked, "And what kind of price range are you considering?" He gave her a vague but fair number, enough to qualify for any mid to high-tier property in the area, including those in their premium Crystal Ridge development. But Tiffany didn't mention Crystal Ridge. Instead, she pulled up listings in older neighborhoods near busy roads and aging schools. When Malcolm casually asked about Crystal Ridge, Tiffany chuckled lightly and said, "Oh, that community's been getting a lot of interest lately. Honestly, it's probably out of reach unless we get very lucky. But I've got some homes over in Maple Hollow, still very nice. And probably more realistic for your budget." Malcolm said nothing. He let her continue, watched her navigate the listings like she was checking off a script. Not once did she offer to dig deeper into his preferences, or even ask what kind of neighborhood his mother might enjoy. 15 minutes later, he left with a stack of listings he didn't ask for and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Driving back through the wide, winding streets of the city, Malcolm felt a low buzz under his skin. There hadn't been any slurs. No blatant rejections. Just carefully chosen words and smooth redirections. But to him, it was clear. Tiffany had already decided who he was and where he belonged before she even knew his name. He pulled into a quiet parking lot, shut off the engine, and sat in silence. This wasn't the kind of thing he could solve with a memo or a diversity workshop. This was deeper, subtler, the kind of rot that didn't show up on spreadsheets or in glossy brochures. He stared at the listings in the passenger seat, then at the company logo embossed on the folder. Something wasn't right, and he wasn't about to let it slide. Later that evening, Malcolm returned to the main office in Midtown. The building was quiet, long after most staff had gone home. The low hum of servers and faint echoes from the janitorial crew filled the space. But his thoughts were louder. He sat in his private office with the lights dimmed, tie loosened, jacket draped across the chair behind him. It had been a long day, but his mind wasn't ready to rest. He called in Eli from the IT team, young, sharp, discreet, I need a full extraction of customer interactions from the Southgate branch. Malcolm said, his voice even but low. Past 3 months. Emails, call logs, survey responses, everything. And I need it off the record. Eli blinked but didn't ask why. He just nodded. I'll get you a secure folder by morning. Malcolm gave a quiet thanks. Then stayed behind long after Eli left, sipping cold coffee and looking out into the night. By noon the next day, he had a stack of reports on his desk. Organized but overwhelming. Dozens of names. Hundreds of lines of feedback. Survey comments ranging from polite to frustrated. One in particular made him stop. Dr. Luther Daniels. Retired physician. Longtime Atlanta resident. Credit score over 800. Income stable. No dependents. His feedback was sharp but articulate. I was not shown the properties I asked for. The agent was pleasant but dismissive, subtly steering me away from neighborhoods I explicitly mentioned. I left feeling like I didn't belong. The assigned agent? Tiffany Green. Malcolm leaned back, heart sinking a little. It wasn't just about his own experience anymore. It was a pattern. He kept reading. More subtle flags. Phrases like, steered me elsewhere. Discouraged. Was told something might not suit my lifestyle. And the trend became hard to ignore. The names. The zip codes. The omitted listings. Later that afternoon, he reached out quietly to a junior employee he'd once mentored from the company's internship program. Her name was Ava Ramirez, now a full-time associate at Southgate. Sharp, ethical, observant. Malcolm had a hunch she knew more than she was letting on. They met after hours, in a quiet corner of a coffee shop 2 blocks from the office. Ava was nervous, glancing around before she spoke. I don't know how much I can say, Mr. Hayes, she said, voice low. But what you're thinking, it's not wrong. Malcolm didn't interrupt. Carl, our branch manager, he doesn't say it out loud. But we all know how the system works. Certain clients get redirected. He uses terms like social fit or neighborhood alignment, but everyone understands what he means. Malcolm pressed gently. And Crystal Ridge? I got reprimanded for showing a black family listing there last month, she said, looking down at her hands. He told me not to set people up for disappointment. I thought I was imagining things at first. But it kept happening. She hesitated. Some of us talk, but no one wants to be the first to say it out loud. I only sent that report because I couldn't take it anymore. Malcolm nodded slowly. I need you to keep this between us for now. I understand, she said, her expression unreadable. Just promise me you won't let this get buried. Back at headquarters, he requested a copy of all transactional records involving Tiffany Green from the previous week, especially any logged on the day of his visit. An hour later, he got a message from IT. File path not found. Possible archive error. Malcolm narrowed his eyes. Pull the access logs. I want to know who touched it last. Eli got back to him 30 minutes later. Someone with admin credentials deleted the file. Not an error. Who? Malcolm asked, though he already sensed the answer. The screen showed a user ID. admin_C_Reddick. Carl Reddick. The file hadn't just been deleted. It had been removed within 24 hours of Malcolm's visit. This wasn't carelessness. It was a cover-up. He leaned over his desk, staring at the empty folder window on his screen. If someone went out of their way to erase evidence, it meant they'd done this before, more than once, and they were confident no one would dig far enough to notice. Malcolm opened his leather-bound notebook, flipped to a clean page, and wrote slowly in blue ink. If they're smart enough to erase the trail, they've been doing this a long time, and I'm going to follow it to the very end. Malcolm didn't waste time. By the following morning, he was back at his desk before sunrise. The city still stretching awake beyond his windows. His phone was already ringing before he finished his first cup of coffee. He ignored most of the calls, routine, scheduled, predictable, but there was one number he dialed himself. A contact he hadn't used in over 5 years. Marcus Bell. Marcus had a reputation, not the sensationalist kind that chased gossip or scandals, but the kind who peeled back layers of polite lies and found what people didn't want seen. Years ago, Malcolm had worked with him to uncover a quiet scheme involving falsified property values. Since then, they'd kept their distance, each returning to their worlds. But Malcolm remembered Marcus's honesty. And more than that, his silence when it mattered. When Marcus picked up, his voice was familiar, steady, skeptical. "Didn't expect to hear from you again, Malcolm. Still chasing real estate ghosts?" "Maybe," Malcolm said. "I've got something that might interest you. I need someone to look into a string of complaints against Bright Living." Discreetly. There was a pause. "You work with them?" "Let's just say I know their floor plans." Marcus chuckled, but his tone sharpened. "What am I looking for?" "Patterns. Discrimination. Anything that stands out." "Who's paying for this?" "You'll get it through my foundation." "Off books." Another pause. "You sound more serious than usual." "I am." While Marcus got to work on the outside, Malcolm moved quietly inside. He handpicked 2 people he trusted beyond titles or office gossip. Ava, whose courage had already proven itself, and Janet Liu, Bright Living's senior legal advisor. She was methodical, loyal, and unshakably fair. Janet didn't ask questions when he brought her in. She read the brief he gave her, brows furrowed, then simply said, "I'll help you find the cracks." To avoid attention, they worked outside the regular structure. Meetings held off-site, files transferred on secured drives, and no company email addresses used. It was an odd little task force, but it was theirs, and it moved fast. Ava dug into the company's internal emails, filtering by keywords like fit, community alignment, and cultural cohesion. What surfaced wasn't damning on the surface, but it made Malcolm's skin crawl. Notes between regional managers like, "Maintain buyer homogeneity where possible. Ensure new residents blend with neighborhood expectations." And worse, "Avoid unnecessary friction by matching cultural profiles." They weren't instructions. They were nudges, just vague enough to fly under radar, but deliberate enough to shape behavior. Meanwhile, Marcus sent over his first round of findings. He'd spoken to former clients who'd come forward after years of silence. The list wasn't long, but the stories were almost carbon copies. People like Cynthia Moore, retired schoolteacher, lived alone, great credit, verified income, perfect references. But when she tried to purchase a home in Crystal Ridge, she was told repeatedly that the listings were unavailable, only to learn later that 2 of those homes sold days after her visit. 2 white families. "I didn't want to believe it," Cynthia had told Marcus, voice trembling over the phone. But it was like being politely shown the back door without anyone actually touching the handle. Malcolm read her statement twice. Then came the real twist. He had requested security footage from his visit to Southgate, just to confirm what he remembered. Maybe even pick up on subtle interactions he might have missed. But when the IT request returned, the footage was gone. System maintenance. The report read, "No files stored on premises that day." It wasn't just missing, it had been erased on purpose. He didn't say a word when Janet brought him the notice, but his jaw clenched so tight she didn't need to ask how he felt. "Someone's scared," she said softly. "No," Malcolm answered, eyes locked on the blank screen where the video should have been. "Someone's confident they're untouchable." Janet, working separately, had uncovered something else, a curious training document dated back 2 years. It was labeled, "Internal Use Only," and carried a neutral title, "Client Matching and Market Analysis." But inside were phrases that mirrored everything Malcolm feared. Assess compatibility between prospective buyers and long-term neighborhood identity. Discourage placement where value erosion is statistically more likely due to cultural mismatch. There was nothing explicit, no mention of race or background, but the intent was woven into every line. When Ava walked in with the printed materials, Malcolm didn't hesitate. He took the stack, set it neatly on the conference table, and looked at both women. "We're not investigating a rogue agent," he said quietly. "We're investigating a strategy." The room went still. He let the weight of those words hang in the air for a moment longer before adding, "And we're going to take it apart, piece by piece." The air was cool that morning, with a quiet breeze rustling through the early patio tables outside Janie's Coffee House, a small brick cafe tucked behind a laundromat on the east side. Malcolm arrived early, not in his usual blazer and slacks, but in a simple cardigan and jeans. He didn't want to draw attention. Today, he wasn't a CEO. He was just a man looking for answers. Dr. Luther Daniels walked in right on time. Tall, soft-spoken, and sharp-eyed, He carried the air of someone who had spent a lifetime listening more than speaking. Malcolm stood to greet him, offering a firm handshake and a sincere smile. "Thanks for meeting me, Dr. Daniels. I know this is unusual." The older man gave a small chuckle. "Not the strangest thing I've been asked lately." They sat at a corner table, out of earshot. Malcolm didn't open with titles or disclaimers. He simply said, "I'm looking into how certain clients have been treated. I came across your name more than once." Luther nodded slowly, then reached into his leather messenger bag. "I figured you might." He pulled out a slim manila folder and set it on the table. "I keep records," he said, not out of bitterness, just habit. Inside were printouts of emails, appointment confirmations, and handwritten notes. But what caught Malcolm's eye was the tone of it all, clinical, factual, yet heavy with disappointment. Luther tapped one of the pages. "When I went in, the young woman was polite enough, but she didn't seem interested. I asked about Crystal Ridge. That's where I'd seen the listing. The moment I mentioned it, she got quiet." He paused, then added, "She said something about it not being the right fit for my lifestyle. I asked what that meant, and she just said, it's more family-oriented, more activity-based. You might not find it comfortable." Malcolm exhaled through his nose, jaw tight. "There's more," Luther said. "After I followed up via email, I got a reply from someone higher up. A manager, I think. He wrote, 'We are striving to preserve a culturally unified environment for our residents and hope you understand.'" Malcolm read the line 3 times, then set the page down gently. He could feel something shifting inside him. Not rage, not yet, but something colder, something steadier. Back at headquarters, Ava had been working nonstop, combing through archived call logs and offline recordings that had been left on backup servers. That afternoon, she burst into Malcolm's office, face pale and eyes wide. "I found something. You need to hear this." She played the clip on her phone. The audio was grainy, but the voices were clear enough. It was a recording of Carl Reddick, the branch manager at Southgate, during what sounded like a sales team meeting. Carl's voice carried a confident edge. "We need to maintain the image of Crystal Ridge," he said. "Let's not dilute the neighborhood with mismatched profiles. Sell smart. If someone doesn't fit the vibe, redirect. We're curating a lifestyle, not just selling property." There was light laughter in the background, a few agreeing murmurs, and then silence. Malcolm sat back, stunned. For all the coded language, this wasn't vague anymore. This was clear intent, spoken plainly in front of a team. It wasn't just about perception now. It was about policy, about culture, about control. He forwarded the recording to Janet Liu immediately. Within the hour, she was in his office, pacing with a legal pad in one hand. "If this goes public," she said carefully, "we could face a class action lawsuit, civil rights violations, regulatory penalties, and forget the press coverage, we'll be the face of housing discrimination." Malcolm didn't speak. Janet continued, more gently this time, "I'm not saying we don't confront this, but you need to think carefully. Once this door opens, there's no closing it, and you might not be able to protect the company or yourself." Later that night, Malcolm sat alone in his home office, the city glowing faintly outside his windows. The recording played again in the background, over and over, like a metronome tapping at his thoughts. He stared at the papers spread across his desk, the emails, the training documents, the customer complaints. Carl had worked under him for years, promoted fast, always delivered results. Malcolm had vouched for him more than once. And now this. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk, hands folded tight. How deep did it go? Who else had known? Who else had looked the other way? He was still staring into space when his personal phone buzzed. Unknown number, no name, just a voice, calm. Mail, deliberate. "If you care about what you've built, you'll stop now. This isn't just about a few agents or a neighborhood. They're watching, and they don't like loose ends." Then silence. Malcolm stared at the screen as the call ended. His hand trembled just slightly before he set the phone down. He looked out the window again. This time not at the lights, but at the shadows between them. The office lights were dimmed, and the blinds drawn tight when Malcolm called for the meeting. Janet Liu arrived first, her leather briefcase in hand. Lips pressed into a straight line. Ava followed a few minutes later, her laptop tucked under one arm, eyes wide with anticipation and worry. They sat around the oval table in Malcolm's private meeting room, the one typically reserved for sensitive negotiations and private strategy sessions. Malcolm wasted no time. He laid out every file, printout, and audio clip they had collected. Names, dates, phrases repeated across different communications, customer complaints, the altered training documents, the missing footage, and, of course, the internal recording from Carl Reddick. Carl isn't working alone, Malcolm said, voice calm but heavy. He's smart, but not enough to build this kind of system by himself. There's structure here, language that's been rehearsed. He paused, looking from Janet to Ava. Our next step is him. But we do it by the book. No alarms. Janet nodded slowly. And if he sees through it? Then we'll know just how deep this really goes. The plan was simple on the surface. Malcolm would schedule a surprise audit of the Southgate branch, under the guise of a routine compliance check from headquarters. He wouldn't use his name, just another senior field consultant. Ava and Janet would monitor the interaction in real time from the surveillance hub, watching for anything Carl might let slip. By the time Malcolm arrived at Southgate the next morning, dressed in a modest gray suit and wearing a visitor badge, Carl Reddick was already waiting in the glass conference room, his tie sharp, his smile sharper. Welcome, Carl said with a practiced tone. Always good to get a visit from corporate. Keeps us on our toes. Malcolm returned the smile with one of his own. Just a quick review of standard operating procedures. Nothing too intense. They went through the motions, client intake forms, response time metrics, regional sales performance. Carl answered with ease, tossing out polished statistics and buzzwords like confetti. But when Malcolm shifted the questions toward demographic data, how clients were matched with properties, Carl's posture changed. If only slightly. And how do you determine which listings are best aligned with a client's profile? Malcolm asked. Carl gave a small shrug. We try to match people with communities where they'll feel at home. You know, shared values. Lifestyle compatibility. It's more art than science. Is that what you mean by cultural stability and resident profile cohesion? Malcolm asked, tapping a phrase from one of the training slides. Carl chuckled, eyes narrowing a fraction. That's just soft language to stay competitive. Buyers talk, neighbors talk. We just try to manage expectations. Behind the surveillance feed, Ava leaned closer to the screen. He's dancing around it, she whispered. Janet nodded. He's too smooth, too prepared. And then, Carl slipped. When asked about long-term neighborhood development plans, Carl casually mentioned a group Malcolm had never heard of. Of course, all final zoning adjustments go through the regional market alignment team. They reevaluate property assignments to avoid long-term community mismatch. Malcolm blinked. Sorry, regional market alignment team? Carl paused, realizing the slip. It's more of an informal review board. Just to help guide listings where they make the most sense demographically. Internal stuff. Malcolm offered a neutral smile. I'd like to see their reports sometime. After the meeting ended, Carl walked Malcolm to the elevator, his tone unchanged. But the moment the doors closed, Ava sent an alert to Malcolm's phone. She had intercepted an outgoing email from Carl's terminal. The subject line was innocuous enough, but the content was anything but. Head office sent someone. I kept the script tight. Everything's still under control. The message was addressed to a contact labeled only as RL. Back in his office, Malcolm ran the trace with IT. It didn't take long. RL was Rebecca Langston, Senior Vice President of Market Strategy, a founding partner, his closest advisor. The revelation hit Malcolm like a blow to the chest. Rebecca had been there from the start. They'd built Bright Living together. They had sat side by side drafting the company's first mission statement, one that promised fair housing and equitable development. She was the one who had helped him push back when investors doubted his vision. She'd stood next to him at conferences, shaking hands with community leaders, pledging transparency and inclusion. And now she was coordinating back-channel conversations with a man like Carl Reddick. Alone later that evening, Malcolm sat in the dark of his office. The city outside shimmered with weekend lights, but he couldn't see any of it. His laptop glowed faintly, displaying a photo taken years ago, Malcolm and Rebecca standing side by side in front of Bright Living's original headquarters. Beaming with pride, their arms crossed in quiet victory. Beneath the photo was a framed quote, "Bright Living is for everyone." He hit play on the audio file again. Carl's voice filled the room. "Let's not dilute the neighborhood with mismatched profiles." Malcolm closed his eyes and clenched the small recorder in his hand. The picture on the screen stared back at him. Once a moment of hope, now a wound he wasn't sure would heal. The city skyline shimmered under the late afternoon sun as Malcolm stepped out of the car and into the sleek glass lobby of the Delmere Hotel. The doorman tipped his hat as he passed, but Malcolm barely acknowledged it. His thoughts were elsewhere, upstairs, on the rooftop, where a table had been reserved under the name of a consulting firm that didn't really exist. The restaurant was all polished wood and soft jazz, the kind of place that whispered money and discretion. He was shown to a table tucked in a quiet corner, overlooking the skyline. Just as he adjusted his napkin, Rebecca Langston appeared, effortlessly elegant in a navy silk dress that caught the fading light. She smiled like they were old friends sharing a drink, not adversaries crossing a line. "You always did have good taste in venues," she said as she sat. "This place brings back memories. Some of them better than others." Malcolm replied, his voice even. They ordered drinks. Small talk came first. Market trends, regional growth, a brief laugh about a rival company's failed expansion. And then Rebecca leaned in, crossing one leg over the other, posture poised and controlled. "We're in a phase of rapid demographic realignment," she began, swirling her wine. "There's a lot of pressure. Homebuyers want consistency, comfort. We've had to get creative to avoid conflicts. Neighborhoods function better when expectations align." Malcolm didn't flinch. "Is that what we're calling it now? Creative alignment?" Rebecca tilted her head slightly. "You of all people understand that disruption comes with consequences. You introduce friction, you get lawsuits, declining value, tension in the boardroom." Malcolm nodded slowly. "And Carl Reddick? Did he come up with this creative strategy on his own?" She smiled again, cooler now. "Carl has initiative. Sometimes it's useful to let capable people build local frameworks." He let the silence stretch before replying. "Strange how those frameworks come with deleted video footage, missing records, scrubbed client complaints." Rebecca didn't blink. "In a system this big, things fall through the cracks. We can't babysit every branch." Malcolm reached into his jacket and pulled out a small black USB drive. He placed it on the white linen tablecloth between them, as casually as setting down a coaster. "In there is Carl's voice, talking about you. About instructions. There's also the recovered email. IT traced it. Yours." She didn't reach for it. She didn't even glance down. But the smile vanished, just for a moment. Then she looked him dead in the eye and said, "If I told you I did this to protect the company's value, would you believe me?" Malcolm sat back, studying her face. "Try me." Rebecca exhaled slowly, her voice softer now. "This isn't about hate or exclusion. It's about preservation. You remember 5 years ago, the lawsuit over the neighborhood dispute in Brookline? We buried it. That happened because someone sold the wrong house to the wrong buyer. That one decision triggered protests, news coverage, legal bills. Property values dropped 10% in under a month." She paused. "I watched that happen and realized, inclusion is a beautiful idea, Malcolm, but the market isn't ready for it. Investors aren't ready. The neighborhoods aren't ready. We don't get to experiment with utopia when people's mortgages are on the line." Malcolm leaned forward, his voice steady, quiet. "So you built a wall. You dressed it up in policy and metrics and called it cohesion. But it's segregation." Rebecca, with spreadsheets. Her eyes flashed, the first crack in her composure all evening. "The world doesn't run on ideals," she said, sharper than before. "It runs on self-interest. You've always known that. You just never had the stomach to admit it. I made the hard calls you wouldn't." He looked at her for a long moment. Not the woman across from him, but the version of her he used to know. The ally who once helped him fight for access, for fairness. That version was gone. He stood up. Rebecca stayed seated, staring past him at the skyline. Malcolm didn't offer a farewell. As he stepped into the elevator and descended into the hum of the evening crowd, he pulled out his phone and called Janet. "Start phase 2. He said quietly, "We're going after the top." It was still dark outside when Malcolm arrived at the office. A to-go cup of black coffee in hand and the edges of sleep still clinging to the corners of his mind. But the weight of what they were about to do had burned away any trace of fatigue. Inside the executive war room, Janet and Ava were already seated, laptops open, files spread across the table like blueprints for a revolution. "This is it," Malcolm said, setting his cup down. "We don't aim small anymore. We're going for the whole web." Janet tapped the screen, bringing up a project file labeled Phase 2. It outlined the plan. Expose not just individual wrongdoers like Carl or Rebecca, but the system they operated within. A pattern of policy manipulation, disguised under benign phrases like market alignment and demographic forecasting. They had to act quickly but precisely. Malcolm would use his position as CEO to schedule a company-wide virtual meeting, framing it as a quarterly review of growth strategies. Every regional director, every high-level manager, and every market analyst would be there. But the real purpose wasn't to discuss growth. It was a trap. The call went live at 11 a.m. sharp. Dozens of faces appeared on screen, some relaxed, others clearly annoyed by the surprise invitation. Malcolm welcomed them, voice calm, tone measured. "We're taking a deeper look at how our strategy has played out in the past 3 quarters. He began, specifically, how we approach neighborhood development and client placement. He started walking through slides that looked, on the surface, like typical quarterly updates. But Ava had carefully woven in examples, real ones, disguised just enough to avoid direct exposure, yet pointed enough to make certain individuals sweat. "For instance," Malcolm said, clicking to the next slide, "we've seen patterns where customers are redirected from high-demand listings despite having qualifying credit and verified income. Coincidentally, these customers often share certain demographic characteristics. Is that a coincidence, or something else?" A few heads on screen tilted, pretending curiosity. Others stiffened. One director in Arizona disconnected mid-sentence, citing technical difficulties. Another in Florida went silent, eyes darting away from the webcam. Malcolm continued, deliberate and calm. "In the same time frame, we've had unusual data loss from security systems across 3 separate branches. Video files gone, CRM logs wiped. On paper, those might be unrelated, but we all know better." By the time the meeting ended, the room was quiet. Afterward, Ava pulled up a recovered email thread she'd been digging through for days. Carl, Rebecca, and at least 4 regional directors had exchanged messages using carefully chosen code. Terms like package transfers to Zone B and maintain cohesion metrics had been used repeatedly. But it was one document that made Malcolm pause. A memo from Carl's office, dated 8 months prior, listed restricted zip codes for Crystal Ridge. Among them, 30,318, 30,310, and 30,314, areas with predominantly black populations. The file was tagged, internal use only. "This isn't policy drift," Janet said, reading over his shoulder. "It's coordinated discrimination." They knew exactly what they were doing. That afternoon, Marcus Bell reached out. "I've got something you need to see," he said, voice crackling through the phone. "There's a civil rights litigation group, Jefferson and Braithwaite. They've been building a case, targeting real estate companies using predictive analytics to quietly gatekeep buyers of color." He sent over a draft of the class action complaint. Bright Living Properties sat at the very top of the list. Malcolm sat in silence. The walls of his office felt closer than usual. "We get ahead of it," he finally said. "We give them everything, before this turns into a witch hunt." Janet looked at him carefully. "You want to leak our own files?" "I want to hand over the truth, on our terms." She nodded, then got to work. Within 48 hours, they'd compiled a full evidence package: emails, audio clips, policy drafts, rejected client records, everything. They sent it through a secure channel, signed only with the initials MH. By the end of the week, word spread. The legal team representing the plaintiffs had new intel. Detailed, sourced, and clean. Someone inside had blown the whistle. Rebecca caught wind of it quickly. Board members began calling each other in a panic. Rebecca convened an emergency executive meeting. demanding to know how sensitive documents had been compromised. There were whispers of sabotage, betrayal. Trust began to fracture inside the glass walls of the boardroom. Not yet. That night, while preparing for the emergency board meeting, Malcolm stared at the last page Ava had printed. A spreadsheet of rejected homebuyers over the past year, cross-referenced by race, income, and zip code. A solid red line ran through the rows representing black clients. Across the top of the page, Malcolm had scribbled in black ink the real numbers. He folded the paper and slid it into his briefcase. Tomorrow, they wouldn't just be facing a boardroom. They'd be facing the truth. The boardroom on the 23rd floor was colder than usual, not because of the air conditioning, but because of what was about to unfold. The windows stretched across the skyline, but no one was looking out. Everyone's eyes were on each other, guarded, waiting. Rebecca Langston sat at the far end, elegant as ever, her silver necklace catching the light. Carl Reddick, recently summoned from Southgate, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. 3 major shareholders sat flanking the center, each with voting power that could change the fate of Bright Living in an instant. Janet Liu sat to Malcolm's right, a quiet anchor. Ava wasn't present, but her data had spoken volumes already. Rebecca started before anyone else could. "There's been a leak," she said, her tone crisp, almost surgical. "Internal materials, selectively edited, I might add, have been sent to outside legal teams. These aren't facts. This is a coordinated campaign from within to discredit leadership based on differences in vision." She glanced at Malcolm briefly, her gaze unreadable. "I urge the board to vote on opening an investigation into the source of the leak. Not the claims themselves. Let's not be manipulated by sensationalism." Malcolm didn't flinch. He simply opened the folder in front of him and began placing documents one by one on the conference table. Printed emails, transcripts, charts in bold red and blue. He tapped a button on the tablet beside him, and the large monitor on the wall flickered to life. It played clips from the national meeting, brief cuts of awkward silences, nervous looks, and managers logging off mid-call. Then came the audio. Carl's voice, hesitant but clear. "We just want to keep Crystal Ridge aligned with the image we've worked hard to build. Let's not water it down with misaligned profiles." Carl turned pale. Rebecca's fingers tensed on her notebook. Malcolm looked around the room. "That's not strategy. That's exclusion." Carl started to speak, but Janet stood and placed a small recorder on the table. Her voice was even. "This is the uncut version. Carl, would you still like to explain it away?" There was a long silence. Carl's shoulders slumped. "I didn't come up with it," he said finally. "It was passed down. I just followed what was expected." "From whom?" one board member asked. Carl hesitated, looked at Rebecca, then down at the table. He didn't answer. The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. But it was David Lynn, longtime board member and usually the quietest in the room, who leaned forward. "I once supported demographic modeling," he began, voice calm but heavy. "It made sense from a market risk standpoint. Or so I thought." He paused, then added, "Last month, my son, my adopted son, who's black, was denied a showing at a Bright Living property. He didn't use my last name. No one knew he was connected to me. No one moved." David continued. "He had perfect credit, solid income, yet he was told the area wasn't a good fit. And now I sit here and realize I helped build the wall that turned him away." Rebecca looked stunned, but her composure held, barely. "I have no further interest in supporting a structure that shuts out people like my own family," David said quietly. Silence fell again, this time deeper, more absolute. Malcolm stood slowly. "This ends today," he said, effective immediately. Bright Living will adopt a transparent client placement policy. No customer will be denied based on zip code, racial proxy, or demographic mapping. Any exceptions must be tied to legal compliance. And nothing more. He turned toward Rebecca and Carl. "I'm also calling for the resignation of both Carl Reddick and Rebecca Langston. Not because they're solely responsible, but because accountability must start from the top. We cannot build something new if those who broke it remain." Rebecca rose to her feet. Her voice was still smooth, but there was a sharp edge now. "You might win today," she said, "but you've given up control. You traded order for chaos. Don't expect to shape what comes next." Malcolm looked at her, calm and steady. No, I'm reclaiming what should have never been lost. She didn't reply, just turned and walked out, heels tapping softly against the floor. Carl followed moments later, not looking at anyone. Malcolm stood for a while, alone now with the documents still spread across the table. It wasn't victory that he felt. It was responsibility. The day after the boardroom reckoning, Malcolm had hoped for a moment to breathe. But peace, as he was beginning to learn, didn't come easy to those who tried to tear off masks. He was in his office just after 7 a.m., poring over the latest compliance drafts Janet had prepared, when his phone buzzed with an unknown number. He answered, expecting a reporter or legal notice. What he got was a voice that didn't belong to anyone he knew. "If you keep feeding those civil rights lawyers," the voice warned flatly, "you'll see your name in places no reputation survives. You think people forgot who you were before Bright Living?" The line went dead before Malcolm could respond. He stared at the phone for a long moment, then set it down without a word. Just before noon, Marcus Bell called, his tone clipped and urgent. "Malcolm," he said, "something's just gone live on social media. It's bad." He forwarded the link. Malcolm clicked and watched in stunned silence. It was a video, edited, choppy, clearly spliced. In it, he was shown speaking at a company retreat from 7 years ago. But the audio had been twisted to make it seem like he advocated prioritizing minority buyers to reshape community optics. It wasn't true. In context, he'd been talking about expanding outreach to historically underserved groups. But the cut made it sound like he wanted to skew the market in favor of one race over another. The clip had already gained traction. Thousands of views, angry comments, headlines forming. CEO who preaches fairness once pushed racial favoritism. Janet stormed into his office 30 minutes later. "It's fake," she said, holding up her laptop. "Deepfake audio. Spliced footage. We're tracing it, but the trail's been scrubbed clean." By evening, Ava had something. She'd found a link to a shell PR firm that had once subcontracted for Bright Living during Rebecca's tenure. The IP that uploaded the clip matched a proxy server associated with them. Not proof in court, but enough to see the fingerprints. Even outside the company, Janet muttered, "She's still pulling strings." Malcolm sat in silence, not out of defeat, but out of weariness. He had spent weeks clawing toward truth, only to be slapped with lies. His name was being dragged through digital mud. It wasn't just professional, it felt personal. That night, he went home early. Ella was sitting at the kitchen table, legs swinging as she worked on a drawing of their house. She looked up and smiled. "Daddy, are people mad because you help folks like us buy homes?" The innocence in her voice caught him off guard. He sat beside her, gently pulling her pencil from her hand. "Some people," he said carefully, "don't like when others are treated fairly, especially if it means they lose a little control." "Is that why someone at school said you make trouble?" she asked. Her brow furrowed. She said her mom read that online. Malcolm's breath caught. He looked into her eyes, those same deep eyes as his, and felt something shift. This wasn't about boardrooms or press cycles. It wasn't about public image. It was about what she would inherit. Whether she would grow up in a world where she believed people like her deserved less. He pulled her close. "I make trouble," he whispered, "for the right reasons." Back at headquarters, well past midnight, Ava pinged him. She'd recovered something from a drive Rebecca had ordered scrubbed 2 months ago. "It's encrypted," she said, "but I cracked a portion of it." She sent over a file titled, "Strategic Segmentation, Long-Term Deployment." Malcolm opened it slowly. It was worse than he expected. Under the guise of advanced data analytics, Rebecca had been developing a behavioral prediction model. It used AI to classify buyers based on speech, attire, hobbies pulled from social media, and more. Buyers would then be assigned optimal neighborhoods to prevent cultural friction. A sanitized phrase for digital redlining. She had laid out timelines, branch by branch rollouts, expected increases in property value, even suggested language for sales reps to use that would sound inclusive while remaining exclusive. It was a system, quiet, invisible, legal on the surface, and devastating in practice. Malcolm read every word, hands tightening around the edge of his desk. No wonder she hadn't fought harder to stay. She didn't need the title to win. She just needed the system to keep running. At 2 a.m., he stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of his office. The city shimmering below. The file still glowed on his screen. A network error occurred. Please check your connection and try again. If this issue persists, please contact us through our help center at help.openai.com. You said, Bat do viet dua tren dan y, d 1.1. Kai su dung tiang an my de viet bai. Com viet trong canvas. Markdown. Com su dung tiu de he gach and gong de fan chia kak don. Su dung the H1 cho tiu de chuang. Viet kai tiet. Bam sat dung dan y. Du so ki tu yu kao. Com lap lai noi dung hoak niok lai don van da viet trong chuang truok. Tat ka noi dung phi sang dao moi hon ton. Dam bao kak chuang ket noi mok lak. Com lak de. Com tak roi koi dan y. Viet hon ton bang tiang an, my. Fu hop voi van wa ki. Tat ka trich dan trong ngoak kep phi dik sang tiang an. Com su dung ki hu, hoak, hash. Com viet in wa ton bo tu hoak kao dai, asterisk. Yu kao vei fong cash viet. Van fong tu nien. Jiang mu mo noi dang ke lai kao choyan hun la mo don van trao chuet. En hip du muat ma, kong kong niok, tran thay doi kong jian dot ngo ma kong ko su lin ket. Loi ke choyan gong gui. Ju noi nghe de hin dung ngay lap tuk. New dang nghe ke qua radio hoak ki uong ka fi. Tak dong kam suk man. Ju kan jia ket noi voi nyan vat va tin hong mo cash chan thuk. Fu hop voi kan jia tren 52 e tai wa ki. Dam bao su ro rang. De hu, mok lak va tu nien. Yu kao din dang. Noi shuat hin kak nyan vat, C1, C2, C3, C4, C5, C6, C7, C8, C9, C10. Hoak kak viet tat kak duok gon ki lap dan yt he gon 10 ku the thay vi su dung ki hu viet tat dang, C1, C2, C3, C4, C5, C6, C7, C8, C9, C10. Bat do chuang bang tiu de chuang. The H1. Chapter N. Title. Ket thuk chuang bang the H2. End of chapter N. V do. Bat do chuang one sela. Ket thuk chuang one sela. Tran trung lap noi dung and kao choyan gun kam suk, Y1. Moi fan noi dung phi doc dao. Tran lap lai cash mo ta. Tu vung hoak hin an jua kak chuang. Kong dung lai kum tu. Cash din dat trong kak chuang truok. Ki ket thuk chuang. Thay doi cash din dat kam suk. Su dung hin an moi. Hoak ket hop kam suk nyan vat voi boy gun. Chuang 10. Mo koa buk tuong vo hin. Approximately 4.000 ki 2. Mo do chuang. Malcolm Quay din kong fan ung bang cash fu nyan. Ma thay vao du chu dong to chuk mo buoi hop bao kong kai. Doi mat voi truyen thong. Kak hang. Nyan veen. Va ka kong chung. Ong chuan bai mo bai fat biu. Kong fong vei. Ma la thua nyan. Lam ro va cam ket thay doi. Hop bao kong kai. Trong mo con fong lon. Voi hang chuk fong veen va me ki. Malcolm buok len buk. Ong bat do bang kao. Toi kong hon hao. Va kong tai kua toi kung kong. Nung su that kong can duok dan bong. No can duok lang nghe. Tuyen bo man mi. Ong thua nyan tung ko nung chin sak mo ho. Tung tin tuong sai noi. Va tung giu im lang de bao vei su on din. Nung geo day. Ong tuyen bo ton bo he thong dan gia va fan bo kak hang say bai lo I bo. Thay the bang mo ko che min bok. Giam sat boy ben tu ba doc lap. Sao trao trian thong. Trong fan hoi dap. Mo fong veen hoi. Ong ko so min say bai hoi hoi boy chin su that ma ong dang kong bo kong. Malcolm dap. Toi so mo tu kak hun. Rang toi say song voi su hen nyat ki biat ma kong han dong. Twist niget tho. Nge sao buoi hop bao. Ava fat heen he thong made shu kua kong tai dang bai tan kong gom. Ko I du dang ko zo sak du lu lin quan den kak email ku. Dak biat la nung tai lu ko ten Rebecca. Janet kai dao fong toa he thong noi bo ngay lap tuk. Quoc she dua voi thoi jion. Malcolm kung ava va num ki thwat ko gang giu lai ban sao du lu truok ki no bai fa hoi. Mo don ma and duok fat heen trong he thong quan li trung tam. Cho thay hacker da kai vau tu truok. Ko ka nong den tu chin num kong nagi ma Rebecca tung du han. Tin tiet then chot. Marcus Bell tung ra mo bai bao du trangay trong dem. Ko tuada. Noi dung len tu ben trong. Quoc chien chong lai he thong fan biat trong non bat dong san. Bai bao lan rong. Nyan duok su ung ho lon tu kong dong da mao. Joy luat su. Von yu nyan vat ko an hong exa hoi. Ket thuk chuang. Trong mo buoi tro choyen sao hop bao. David Lin. Ton vien hoi dong quan tri den bat te Malcolm va noi. Chung ta vua dap mo vien da zong mat ho. Nung nung gon song kai mwa bat do lan. 2 halves. Chat GPT said. Malcolm spent the early morning walking the length of the conference hall before anyone else arrived. The podium stood in the middle of the room like a silent witness, framed by rows of empty chairs that would soon be filled with reporters, employees, shareholders, and a public hungry for answers. He adjusted the mic, not for sound, but for steadiness. His heart was quiet, not because he felt no fear, but because the time for hiding had passed. By noon, the room buzzed with quiet anticipation. Cameras were positioned, phones were live streaming. The official bright living banner hung behind him. But he knew that today, no symbol would shield him. He stepped up to the podium, cleared his throat once, and began. I'm not perfect, and neither is the company I built, he said, eyes steady. But truth isn't something you polish. It's something you listen to. There was a pause in the room, not silence, but attention, the kind of quiet when people lean forward instead of away. Malcolm didn't read from his notes. He spoke from the gut. He admitted that there were vague policies in the past, that he trusted the wrong people, stayed silent when he should have pushed back, and protected comfort over correction. He didn't offer excuses. He offered responsibility. That ends today, he said. We are dismantling every internal system that assigns value to buyers based on anything other than financial credibility and housing needs. All future assessments will be overseen by an independent third party with full access and authority. He outlined the reforms: transparent metrics, public audits, whistleblower protections, and a standing advisory board made up of community leaders from diverse backgrounds. Then came the Q&A. A reporter from a major news network stood. Mr. Hayes, aren't you afraid this will destroy your reputation? You're giving ammunition to your critics. You're handing over everything they need to bury you. Malcolm nodded slowly. He looked out at the rows of people and answered without flinching. I'm more afraid of something else, he said. I'm afraid of being the man who knew what was wrong and chose not to act. I'm afraid of letting my daughter grow up thinking silence is strength. That kind of fear weighs heavier than headlines. The room stayed quiet for a second too long. And then the applause began, not loud, but genuine, as the press filed out and conversations began swirling in corners of the room. Malcolm felt a buzz from his phone. It was Ava. Her message was short. Check systems. We've got a breach. He left the room without ceremony. By the time he reached the tech floor, Ava and Janet were already pulling up diagnostics on a shared monitor. Red flags blinked across the screen. Segments of Bright Living's internal servers were being accessed remotely. Someone was trying to wipe out archival data, especially files tied to Rebecca Langston. We've locked down access for now, Janet said, eyes scanning a matrix of commands. But the breach came through a backdoor script. Buried deep. This isn't just a disgruntled contractor. It's someone who had full clearance before. Ava nodded. Could be remnants from Rebecca's old dev team. The script's been dormant for months, waiting for a trigger. Then let's trigger it in reverse, Malcolm said. Trap whoever's pulling the strings. Over the next 3 hours, the team raced against the code. They isolated the intrusion, traced command histories, and copied every threatened file to secure servers offline. It wasn't just a digital cleanup. It was war in slow motion. Just after midnight, Marcus Bell published a piece online. The headline read, "The Man Who Stood Up, Fighting Back Against Quiet Discrimination in Real Estate." The story was raw, honest, and it didn't frame Malcolm as a hero. It painted him as a man who'd built something, looked away for too long, and then chose to face what he'd ignored. It struck a chord. By morning, the article had been shared over 1 million times. Support poured in, emails, statements from civil rights organizations, tweets from public figures, and letters from families who had faced housing discrimination firsthand. Still in the office, Malcolm watched as the media tide began to shift, not from admiration, but from recognition. Later that afternoon, as the sun lowered across the skyline, David Lynn walked into Malcolm's office. He didn't speak right away, just looked out the window at the city that had once felt so neatly divided. Then he extended his hand. "You dropped a stone in still water," he said. "The ripples are just starting." Malcolm stood, shook his hand. "We better start swimming," he replied. In the days following the press conference, Malcolm's name became a lightning rod. Cable news segments dissected his every word. Commentators called him bold, reckless, brave, naive. On social media, the headlines clashed. "CEO tells the truth" versus "Is bright living crumbling?" Support poured in, yes, but so did the backlash, particularly from those whose interests were tangled in the old ways of doing things. Behind the scenes, a storm was gathering. A notice arrived on Malcolm's desk one rainy morning, a request for an emergency board session. No pleasantries, no small talk, just a cold, corporate phrase to evaluate the financial impact of the CEO's recent unilateral disclosures. He didn't need a translator. The message was clear. The walls were closing in. Later that same day, Janet entered his office without knocking. She had that look, tight jaw, calm eyes, but something uneasy in her voice. "Rebecca's still pulling strings," she said. "She's been speaking with at least 3 board members through intermediaries. They're talking market instability, investor panic, threats of shareholder revolt." Malcolm leaned back, closed his eyes for a moment. "She's not done. She's using the only weapon she has left, fear." Janet placed a folder on his desk. Inside were screenshots of messages traced back to a firm linked to Rebecca's old PR agency. The chatter hinted at engineered rumors, timed leaks, and even a push to tank Brightliving's stock unless Malcolm stepped down. "If you resign now," Janet said, her voice gentle, "you give the company a chance to breathe. Let someone continue the reforms from inside, without dragging you through the fire." But later that night, in a quiet corner booth of a late-night diner, Marcus Bell didn't sugarcoat it. "If you step down," he said, stirring his coffee, "Rebecca wins. Not because she comes back, but because the message is sent. Tell the truth. And we'll break you." People like her wait in shadows. They don't believe in justice. They believe in fatigue. Sooner or later, the good guys get tired and lay down the sword. Malcolm didn't argue. He didn't need to. He just stared through the window at the parking lot lights, the raindrops running down the glass like silent verdicts. The next day, Malcolm drove alone to the cemetery on the outskirts of the city. He didn't go often, but today wasn't for tradition. He stood by his father's grave, a man who had fought in 2 wars. Returned home with medals but no mortgage. A veteran who was denied a house loan simply because his skin was the wrong color. Malcolm sat in the wet grass beside the headstone. Let the silence speak longer than any words. He pulled out a small notepad, the kind his father used to keep in his shirt pocket. The ink from his pen was unsteady, but the words were firm. "I've been given a seat at the table you never got to see. But if I let it stay the same, I've only become part of the shadow that shut you out." That evening, the boardroom was full, every seat taken, the air tight with tension. The conservative faction didn't waste time. A vote of no confidence was proposed before Malcolm had even taken his seat. No introductions, no small talk. The motion was seconded. Rebecca's influence still lingered like a bad perfume. Malcolm didn't bring a statement. No prepared remarks. No theatrics. Just a small USB drive in his palm. He stood, walked to the console, and plugged it in. The speakers clicked on. It was a recording from a year ago, one that Ava had recently decrypted. In it, Rebecca's voice was crystal clear. "We don't need customers who sympathize. We need them uniform. Same look, same talk, quiet, predictable, controllable." Silence followed. You could hear a throat clear in the back. A pen fall on the table. Then, David Lynn spoke. He hadn't said a word all meeting. But now his voice carried weight. "We don't need a flawless CEO," he said, looking directly at Malcolm. "We need someone willing to clean up what others left behind, even if he didn't make the mess." He slid his vote across the table. Confidence in Malcolm Hayes. One by one, others followed. The motion failed. Malcolm stayed. As he left the room, Janet caught up to him in the hallway. "You did it," she whispered. Malcolm shook his head, eyes distant. "We held the seat," he said, "but the seat's worthless if we don't use it to do what's right." The morning sun hadn't yet warmed the glass of the Bright Living headquarters when Malcolm stepped into the executive broadcast suite. Every screen across their offices nationwide, every tablet in the hands of field agents, every laptop open in living rooms and break rooms, was waiting for him. This wasn't another PR recovery effort. This was something deeper, the beginning of something different. He adjusted the collar of his shirt, exhaled slowly, and looked directly into the lens. "I stand before you today," he began, "not just as your CEO, but as someone who's learned, sometimes painfully, that silence can be as harmful as complicity." He didn't speak with grandeur or dramatic flourish. His words were measured, steady, and human. "We are not the company we promised to be. But that ends today. Not with slogans, not with statements, but with action." Malcolm laid out the plan. The departments responsible for the covert strategies that once funneled people into boxes they didn't belong in? Dissolved. Effective immediately. In their place, a real estate ethics council. Independent, transparent, made up of advocates, civil rights leaders, and, most importantly, former clients who had been hurt by Bright Living's policies. Audits would be frequent, conducted by third parties, and published without edits or filters. Every 6 months. No exceptions, no excuses. He paused, then continued. "This isn't damage control. This is dignity restoration." A small chime sounded. Messages pouring in from employees across the country. One caught his eye. A short message from a junior agent in Southgate, the office where it all began. "Thank you. I thought nobody would ever fight for people like us." He didn't know the sender's name, but he felt the weight of it. All of it. Later that afternoon, Malcolm sat across from two familiar faces, Drive. Luther Daniels and Cynthia Moore. They weren't here as guests for a camera-ready apology. They were here because they deserved better. And he intended to give it to them. "I can't undo what happened," he told them, his voice quiet but unwavering. "But I can make sure the door that was shut in your face gets torn off its hinges." Luther smiled faintly, then leaned forward. "I served this country for 30 years. Mr. Hayes, I've been told, no, in more ways than I care to count. But this is the first time someone in your position said, 'I was wrong.' That means something." Before the meeting ended, both Luther and Cynthia had personal representatives from Bright Living assigned to help them through the buying process, with full transparency. And under the watch of the new Ethics Council. Just as the dust seemed to be settling, Ava knocked softly on Malcolm's door. She held a tablet in one hand, and her expression said more than words could. "I was going through the last of the recovered files," she said, "and there's something you need to see." What she found was a series of encrypted financial transfers tied to a dummy fund. On the surface, it looked like harmless real estate consolidation. But traced carefully, it revealed a pattern. Rebecca hadn't been working alone. The fund had connections with multiple high-level investors in other real estate conglomerates across the country. It wasn't just Bright Living. Malcolm leaned back in his chair, eyes scanning the file. They were beta testing a system. Ava added, "Our company was the prototype." Later that evening, as the lights dimmed across the building, Marcus Bell stepped into Malcolm's office holding a fresh envelope. "I figured you'd want this on your desk tonight," he said, handing it over. "It's not Bright Living, but it's worse. Other companies, big ones, are piloting a customer sorting system. Behavior-based, using scraped social media data to predict who's compatible with certain communities. No disclosures, no opt-ins. Malcolm opened the file, flipping through the reports, screenshots, internal memos. It was all too familiar. Like a ghost of what they'd just faced, only smarter. Slicker. Buried even deeper. He rubbed his temples, let out a slow breath, then chuckled. Just once. Marcus raised an eyebrow. Malcolm looked up. This isn't the end. No. Marcus replied. It never is. Malcolm stood, walked toward the tall windows behind his desk. The city stretched below him, lit up, buzzing, unaware. We thought we were closing the chapter, he said, but all we did was open the first door. He turned back to Marcus, that half-smile still on his face. And now we find out what's on the other side. In the end, Malcolm didn't just fire employees, he exposed a mindset. One that hides behind polished policies and smiles in boardrooms. This wasn't just about real estate. It was about dignity, fairness, and the courage to confront what's broken, even when it's your own house. What would you do if you found out the very system you built was hurting the people you meant to serve? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you believe stories like this need to be told, don't forget to subscribe to Undercover Truths for more powerful journeys that challenge injustice and spark change. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.